So we have a periods of intense violence, on military attacks on civilians perpetuated by the Chinese government, perpetuated at home, perpetuated by the United States in Panama, but also instances of people exerting their own agency for more freedom. The Berlin Wall coming down, and in the following year after the Berlin Wall in 1990, apartheid will end in South Africa. The white South African president, the white president of South Africa, begins a series of reforms to end apartheid, releases Nelson Mandela from prison. Nelson Mandela, the leader of a civil rights organization, basically an anti-apartheid organization within South Africa, who had spent 27 years in prison, right? So from 1963 till 1990. Just for fun, from 1963 also to 1990, Bob Dylan released an album a year on average, 27 albums. So it's a long time. 27 years in prison, and very likely stayed in prison significantly longer, or longer than because there was really no pressure put on the South African government by the United States, particularly in the 80s, as apartheid became a very noticeable and popular thing around the world, right? The system, South Africa had been a British colony, right? When the European countries carved up Africa, it was a British colony, but it has a black majority, but also a substantial Dutch, white South Africans of Dutch ancestry. They're called the Boers or the Afrikaners. And following World War II, there's some decolonization, or in India, Pakistan, South Africa, right? South Africa, basically, Great Britain does not control it anymore. As a result, power is transferred to the white South Africans who initiate apartheid, right? This is in 1948, so around the same time that Jackie Robinson is playing first base for the Dodgers, and the civil rights movement is, we're on the eve of the civil rights movement here, and a Jim Crow-like system, apartheid, very severe, rigid. Really, if you wanted to compare it to something, particularly a contemporary example would be, I would say, Palestine, or the West Bank, Gaza Strip, the relationship with Israel, the limited travel, and then clearly just two separated societies with vast inequality based on which side you're on, But that system ends. But it was able to last as long as it did. Nelson Mandela was in prison as long as he was because they were not a communist regime. They were anti-communist. They actually at one point invaded Angola when Angola was, with our support, the support of our government, when Angola had a sort of a Marxist regime, a popular group that asserting itself there, similar to how we supported the Contras against the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, or groups in El Salvador. Cuba actually sent Angola military assistance in that same since the war, and they were able to defend themselves against the invasion of South Africa. So South Africa was a virulent anti-communist government as a result of that and its importance in our, that containment domino theory mindset, particularly with Ronald Reagan, who wanted to just eliminate communism and forget containment. Let's go right at them. As a result, that was placed over, well, how do they treat racial minorities or ethnic minorities, or how do they treat people of color, however you want to classify it, right? Racism, combating racism around the world was not as important as combating socialism. But Nelson Mandela is released in 1990. He will be elected president in 93 or 94. Yeah. Very inspirational. He comes to the United States after his release from prison. I know some folks who are a little older than me who saw him speak at the Oakland Coliseum, packed 60,000 people, 55,000 people. Nelson Mandela there after 27 years in prison. August of 1990, the nation of Iraq, which is led by a man named Saddam Hussein, They have just fought a decade-long war with Iran. They are hard up for, they're not doing well financially. Kuwait is an oil-rich country. It's very small. Their Iraqi military could easily occupy it. There were issues, all pre-existing issues about recognition of Kuwait, which is not a representative government, it's a monarchy. And all these countries really, I mean, Iran is a country that has existed for a while. I believe it might have been, parts of it or Iran itself may have been at some point conquered by the Arabs, but I don't think it was ever absorbed into the Ottoman Empire, or if it was, if it was at one point, it wasn't one of the countries carved out of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, right? Iraq, Syria, Kuwait, yes, these were parts. So, I mean, the European countries basically just drew these lines, and for the most part, they did similar things in Africa. After they leave, they say, okay, well, you're a country now, regardless of whether the people you've just told are supposed to work together and form a government have ever done that before in their entire lives, or in the history of their civilization, So Iraq invades Kuwait and occupies it in 2 days. 2 days. And they're there for 7 months until the United States comes in and kicks them out, pushes them back into Iraq, institutes no-fly zones in Iraq, so Kuwait's invaded by Iraq. We immediately put troops into Saudi Arabia, bases in Saudi Arabia, launch an attack on Kuwait to push the Iraqis out. This really pisses off a lot of folks in the Islamic world, because Saudi Arabia is where Mecca, Medina, various holy sites are. The idea of having not just an American troop buildup happening there in order to launch some sort of military invasion, but that permanent bases are sort of carved out of Saudi Arabia for the United States is really a thorn in the side of folks like Osama bin Laden, who was once, I wouldn't say a friend of the U.S., but definitely had an amicable relationship with certain people that were involved in Afghanistan in the 1980s. So yeah, and this war where we invaded, we went into to defend Kuwait, is known as Desert Storm or Desert Shield or the Persian Gulf, or the first Persian Gulf War. So if you needed a comparison for that complication, think of like P. Diddy, Puff Daddy, Sean Puffy Combs, right? Yeah, it's very complicated. No, I just say Desert Storm or the first Persian Gulf War, and then followed by a decade of no-fly zones and sanctions against Iraq, which it's estimated killed 500,000 women and children. This is under the Clinton administration, right? We're not actually at war, or we have no troops occupying Iraq. Yeah, and Saddam Hussein is left in power by George H.W. Bush. After this war, this is the first. This is really, we talked about a little bit about Grenada, or little conflicts here and there since the Vietnam War, but this is really the first real major confrontation. Panama to a lesser extent, but this is really the first major engagement since Vietnam. And George H.W. Bush's numbers are going to go through the roof after this because of how swiftly it went, how quickly it went. And also, I mean, people aren't necessarily seeing as much of this war as people saw in Vietnam, right? Vietnam was really the first war where there was television. Once it was recognized how substantial and powerful television could be, people seeing all this imagery from Vietnam raw. Ever since then, there's been much tighter control over where journalists get to go or what they get to see, or mainstream journalists. So yeah, Russia, Soviet Union collapses. That's why it says Russia. It's no longer the Soviet Union in 1991. 16 Soviet republics, various Eastern European states which had been occupied by the Soviet Union. Declare their independence. So, now you have Georgia, Lithuania, Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, all these countries where a lot of good basketball players come from. And Gorbachev resigns and hands power over to Boris Yeltsin, who's now the president of Russia. He's going to remain the president of Russia for a few years, for